Everyone, I'm Tejas Patel. I work on the AD RMS team, basically Active Directory Rights Management Services team in Redmond. Thanks for making it in so early this morning. I know it's the last day of TechEd and you guys probably have a bunch of other sessions you want to go to, but we'll get basically a good session here. And essentially what we want to go over today are the basics of RMS and essentially give you the fundamental concepts to where once you have the more complicated concepts later, you're able to build on the fundamentals and then understand how the system is working. So really, kind of to reiterate, so one is the session objectives. So we just want to I want to be able to explain kind of the fundamentals of information protection with AD-RMS. Two is kind of learn quickly about the capabilities of the platform that we include. And really, the main part is understanding at a low level what's going on during key operations with AD-RMS. And kind of the big thing is, a lot of times I've heard, feedback, what is this AD-RMS thing? It seems awfully complicated. What are all these keys? What do they do? And really what I wanted to kind of do is boil it down to really several simple operations and explaining the key components of AD-RMS. So it kind of makes sense of how everything fits together. So when you're talking about other applications that integrate with RMS, how to deploy RMS, once you have the simple concepts, it'll all kind of click together for you to make it a lot easier to deploy RMS. And then from there, it'll be a lot easier to build at future points. So if you hear AD-RMS again, it's like, oh, okay, you can snap to a mental model of, hey, here are the basics, and I know exactly from this exactly how I need to build on going forward. So one of the things is, like I mentioned, I won't be explaining the hardcore details, advanced features, or specific configurations, but I really want you guys to walk away with the fundamentals of how RMS works today. All right, so kind of a couple of prereqs. I kind of call them prereqs, but I think the main thing is, hey, you've heard of the feature IRM in Office, right? So you go into Office, you click the permissions button, you apply a policy if you've played around with it, and that essentially encrypts the document and provides usage rights to the document. So that's really kind of the main one. The second is the basics of the AD. So we won't be dealing too much with our AD integration today. We'll be touching on several points of how we integrate with AD. But it's just, really just the basics. Hey, I can authenticate against the AD, and AD stores my group information. Those are the main two integration points for RMS. The next is, how IIS and web services work. So RMS is a .NET application, so we're built on ASP. So it's understanding, hey, why is that important? I'll explain why a little bit later. And the basics of cryptography. So it's not so much that you have to know the nitty-gritty of cryptography. We're trying to keep those details away from folks that are using the system, but I'll be kind of going over a few basic concepts and just a really simple model for how RMS works. And in there, we talk a little bit about symmetric and asymmetric encryption, signing certificates, but the main thing I really wanted to go over is the format that RMS uses for crypto operations and how we're a little bit different than X509. And that's kind of leading into the next bucket, which is the fundamentals of PKI. So RMS isn't a PKI system. We don't have any dependencies on PKI. But we're PKI-esque, right? So we're able to protect content, decrypt content, and a lot of signing operations is what we do kind of at the heart of RMS. And the last one is, hey, you guys are awake. Everyone get their coffee, raise their hand. No, breakfast, awesome. So it'll probably take another 20 minutes to kick in, but we'll go ahead and start off with some of the basics. All right, so what is AD-RMS? So AD-RMS is an information protection technology. We originally released it back in 2003, and it started off as a V1 service that was released as an out-of-band service for Windows Server 2003. And then now, with the recent releases, we're inbox within Windows Server 2008 and Windows Server 2008 R2. Now, one of the key parts about RMS is it really provides persistent protection to documents, right? And what that essentially means is that when a document is protected, the encryption actually travels with the document itself. So it's not like typical places where, hey, someone has access control check, you get the document, and then you can do anything with it, right? We always persist the protection on the documents itself. Two, it's location agnostic, right? So if you're within your confines of your enterprise, or you're on a USB stick, or you have a laptop, wherever that file travels, the protection is always carried with the file itself. So that way, if someone who actually gets the file, for example, if someone left a USB stick around, tries to plug it in and access the file, they won't have access to the file unless they have the credentials of the user that it was protected to. Third, and really the kind of the core goal of RMS is to protect against intentional or accidental leakage, right? So we've really seen kind of in the last several years or 5 or 6 years, kind of with more proliferation of email, kind of accidental data leakage that kind of impacts people's reputations, companies' reputations, at least a company sometimes being out of compliance with some of the tougher compliance or the regulatory environment right now. For example, HIPAA, right? So there's requirements that, hey, I need to be able to encrypt personal data, sensitive data, for example, and ADRMS is just one tool to help you maintain that compliance. Now, the thing about RMS is there's really 2 parts to it. One is all about encryption, so how do I protect the document and make sure unauthorized users don't have access to it? And the second is around usage restrictions. So once a user has rights to a particular document, we decrypt the document, but what can they do with the document? So some of the common things you might have seen, for example, in Outlook is the do not forward policy, right? So if I go into Outlook, I click permissions, do not forward, it essentially applies policy to the document that restricts what the user can do with that particular document. And that's more against basically the accidental case, right? Because if there's a malicious user, they're going to be able to do whatever they want, right? They can screen scrape, they can read it out loud, but it's to prevent that real accidental, oops, I accidentally forwarded it to someone outside of my organization. That's really the real intent of the usage restrictions. Now, for ADRMS, we work with several components. So we work with AD to provide identity and group membership, which I mentioned earlier. So for example, if I go ahead and enter in create a new email message, I enter in a group or a distribution list of that message, and then I deliver it to everyone, what ends up happening is the RMS server is actually going to do a group expansion to match the users within the group to what was published to ensure that it gives a little bit more flexibility instead of having to type in everyone's single email address and say, oh, this user 1, user 2, user 3, user 4 has access. So it's a simpler way for folks to be able to manage rights to documents and emails, et cetera. Now, the next component is Windows, right? So we rely a lot on the Windows cryptography stack to provide the key protection capabilities, right? So we end up using a lot of the algorithms that are built into Windows to be able to provide that encryption capability and decryption capability. Now, the next part is kind of Office. So from the Microsoft perspective, Office is kind of our flagship IRM-enabled applications, right? So a lot of times people use RMS and IRM interchangeably, and basically, IRM is a feature name in Office, and RMS is a server-side component that provides that capability to Office. So you can hear those kind of interchange, but at the end of the day, it all means RMS, and IRM is a feature name within the Office applications. And then one of the last things is we've been working a lot with our other applications. So for example, our server-side applications, such as Exchange and SharePoint services, to basically enhance the capabilities. And I'll talk about that a little bit more towards the end of the presentation, because there are actually some very nice features that are integrated within Exchange 2010 and SharePoint 2010. All right, so kind of the main thing about RMS is that traditional solutions protect initial access. So typically, in the past, people have said, okay, let's apply a ACL to a file share. Then you have an authorized user that comes into the file share. They then grab a document or another file. Once the user actually has access to the file, then they're free to distribute it to anyone they want to, right? So with RMS, it's not only about protecting the initial access, it's what's happening after that, right? So the user's gotten it, but they can do anything they want to with the document if it's in an unprotected format, so non-RMS or non-IRM protected. Now, kind of from what RMS does at the heart of it, it's really a couple of things. So we protect documents in email, right? So we're getting broader adoption within the ISV fields for other file types to become IRM enabled as well. 2, it encrypts data, and this is really the main thing. So anytime that file goes anywhere, the data is always encrypted with the file itself. 3, it's going to evaluate the policy on the particular file and grant users access to the file, so essentially decrypting the file for the user. 4, it really provides the usage restrictions I was talking about a little bit earlier. So, hey, if I want to protect against someone accidentally forwarding an email or replying all or copying and pasting or printing, RMS can provide those usage rights as a part of the file format itself. Next, it basically enforces the document security after the file is opened. So it's essentially, hey, once the file is open, the user has done whatever they needed to do, they close it back up again, and then someone, gets it off a USB drive. Basically, the file protection is persistent, so no one's going to be able to get access unless they have the right credentials to it. And the last part, it's really about the central policy via templates. So essentially, RMS offers a feature called templates, and what that does is it makes it a little bit easier for end users to grok the details of the policies that are being applied to their documents. And a lot of times what we've seen in the past is there's often a lot of segmented or segregated IT departments, and the problem is there's no way to really reconcile all of those different policies. So what RMS enables you to do is to say, hey, across the board, within a company, if I apply a particular policy, it's going to mean the same thing, potentially within your HR department, as your finance department, but it gives a central way of managing all the policies within your organization. All right, so let's kind of get into the workflow a little bit. So basically we have two parties here. We have someone that's an RMS author or someone that's creating an RM protected document. And the second is an RMS consumer, and then kind of in the middle is our AD RMS server. So for the first step, it's protection. So essentially what happens is the user is going to get bootstrapped first. And the way that that happens is essentially the user is going to provide their credentials to the Active Directory. What RMS then is going to do is going to talk to the AD to say, hey, is this a legitimate user, and verify their credentials, right? After that has happened, that's really where RMS starts really kind of coming into play. Now what's going to happen is we're going to issue a rights management services identity back to the user. And what that thing is called is essentially called a RAC, or a rights account certificate, and I'll kind of go through the details of that, what that means in a little bit. And then what's going to happen is going to say, okay, well, I've issued a key back to the user. The second part of bootstrapping is something that's called as a client license or certificate, or CLC, is going to be provided back to the user. And all the CLC really is the public key of the RMS server that enables users to protect content to it, right? So it's simple. So if you really take a look at RMS, what it boils down to are two things. One is you're going to have a set of keys on the RMS server. So you're going to have a public-private key pair along with the certificate RMS is using that's generated by RMS. And then on the second side, you're going to have the user key. So essentially, a public-private key for a user pair that's generated by the RMS server. And really, at the end of the day, what RMS is really doing, it's saying, here's how I protected my document using the server key. When a user is requesting rights and is decrypted on the server, essentially, basically what we're saying is take the public key that the user has presented in the request and protect that content back to it. So it's really simple. So I have a public key on the server. My private key can decrypt it. When I'm giving back that decrypted content to the user, you're going to use the user key to protect that information. And then once the content gets back locally to the user's desktop, that's when the decryption happens because it was encrypted to the user's public key. Now in both cases, both of those keys were actually generated and issued by the RMS server. So if you're to walk away with one thing, that's the main thing of how RMS works. It's essentially, I'm giving a key that was generated by the RMS server to essentially decrypt the content back to the user, or encrypt the content back to the user instead of the server. And essentially what that enables is offline access to content, so you don't always have to contact the server for every subsequent decryption. And when we talk about it a little bit more, you're actually not sending the entire document to the RMS server. You're actually sending a small bit of data, which is called the publishing license that I'll describe in a few minutes. So then, basically, on top of, once the author is bootstrapped, basically that's when the applications integrated on top of the RMS client come into play. So basically with the RMS client, what's going to happen, or the application in conjunction with the RMS client, what they're going to do is create this thing called a publishing license. And all the publishing license does is basically describe the set of rights that the author has granted to another user. And that what that will include is, hey, do they have permissions in general to decrypt this document? But it also will contain all the usage rights that the party will have, or any of the users will have, to that particular piece of content. So then what I'm going to do is I'm going to send that, or deliver it, or hand it off to the consumer. So what's going to happen on the consumption side is, let's just go ahead and assume that the recipient is already bootstrapped to the RMS server, so they're going to click on a file. And within the file itself, what they're going to actually do is send up the recipient credentials, but they're going to send two key pieces of data from their client. So one, as I mentioned before, is the rack, right? Because that's how we're going to protect the content back to the user so they can open it. And the second part is a publishing license, so RMS can actually do the authorization logic to ensure that the user has rights to a given document. Now, the way that documents find the RMS server is within the publishing license, there are essentially two URLs baked into there, right? So what it's actually doing is taking a look at the URL of the RMS server. The RMS client is then going to take that URL, contact the RMS server, and it's going to send up those two artifacts, so the rack and the publishing license. Now, what RMS is then going to do is going to go ahead and evaluate the policies within that particular publishing license to say, hey, what rights does this particular user have to this document? And then once it goes ahead and evaluates the rights, what it's going to end up doing is going to take that particular, it's going to go ahead and decrypt one time on the server, and then what it's going to do is going to take that rack, and then it's going to encrypt it back to the user. So that way, when the user receives it, they're able to decrypt it, and then basically what's going to happen is once it's decrypted, the application then renders the file with the appropriate usage rights to that user, right? So that's kind of the crux of RMS. It's basically, I have one key on the server that's going to do my decryption, but I want to make sure that it's always protected back to the user and the user can decrypt it, or it's, in essence, the application can decrypt it on behalf of the user. All right, so here's kind of an example of a rights-protected document. So I've kind of put two sides in there. So one is the publishing end and one is the consumption end. So really what ends up happening is, so when I create a file that's RMS protected, the first thing that gets created is what's known as a publishing license. And kind of in shorthand terms, a lot of times people just call it a PL, right? But it's a publishing license. And what that's going to contain is all of the rights and everything that's for given users within the document. Now what ends up happening is there's something else which is called a content key, right? So a content key is the actual item that provides the encryption, decryption capabilities of a given document, right? And for this, and I'll kind of talk through the flows of which keys were used where, but the main thing here is essentially we use a symmetric key because if files get really large and bloated, we don't want to spend a lot of CPU cycles going ahead and processing and churning and everything else. But essentially, that's what's actually protecting the document. Now, there's another part in there, which is the actual publishing license, right? So there's a content key and the rights info, and that's what actually consists of the publishing license. Now, the rights information, that's actually protected by the server public key as well. And that's the small, that's part of the small chunk of data that ends up making it over to the server, right? So between the content key, just that ASIM key, just to do the decryption, and the rights information, that's what's sent to the server or the RMS server to be evaluated. Now, below there, basically the content key is basically a secure 128-bit AES key, symmetric encryption key. And so that's kind of the basic file format once you've published a document. Now, on the right-hand side, essentially, there's the end-user license. So after the RMS server gets the publish license and the rack as a server request, what we're going to generate on the RMS server is what's known as an end-use license, or EUL. And basically, what ends up happening is the end-use license actually, depending on how the application has implemented RMS, actually gets embedded as a part of the file, right? So depending on the rights that you're given, because in RMS we support a lot of different rights, right? We can say, hey, every time you're coming to the server, you must request a new use license. Or if the data isn't that sensitive, what we can say is, hey, you might have to come back every 2 weeks, or you'll never have to come back to the server to request a use license again. But basically, it's only embedded, the use license is only embedded if the application or the policy says to do so. So it gives a little bit more flexibility. Now, what's also returned back is the rights for a particular user, right? So if someone sent mail to me, RMS server is going to say, hey, here's the rights for me, Tejas, within the document. And that's all you're going to get back in the use license. You're not going to get back the publishing license, which contains the rights for everyone. It's only scoped to a given user when you're given an end-use license. The second is the rights for a particular user is actually encrypted by the user public key. So remember, we want to be able to make sure that the user can decrypt that document. So as soon as we decrypt it on the server, we re-protect it back to the user's key. And the last part is the content key. So this is the place where the decryption of the file happens, right? So the content key is basically this wrapper around the document, and basically that's what is controlling the file decryption itself. And that's also encrypted back to the user's public key. Yeah, and I know it's kind of early in the morning to be talking about crypto, so I'll take questions at the end as well. Now for Outlook, it's a little bit different today. So they actually cache licenses in what's known as an end user license store, and I'll kind of show you some of the formats, how that file format looks like in a couple of minutes. But essentially, it's up to the application how they want to cache that end use license, whether they want to keep it on a local store or they want to keep it as a part of the item itself. All right, so what's an RMS certificate? So ADRMS uses certificates for identity and licenses, and that really means two things. So one is when the user is actually bootstrapping to the system, RMS is going to generate a certificate for that user that identifies them, that we verified, right? So based on the identity, we'll generate a certificate that's then given back to the user. And it kind of contains two things that I'll talk about in a few minutes. But the next big point that we wanted to, I kind of want to bring through is ADRMS doesn't use X509 certificates. It's actually using a different format, which is called XRML. And I'll show you kind of how that format looks in a while. But kind of from the underlying infrastructure, when we're talking about all the key operations, it works very similar to PKI and kind of an X509 system, but it's a little bit different because the certificate formats are different. And really, the reason for that is we want to be able to include all the rich usage policy rights that a given user has to a particular document, right? So it's very hard to express that within X509. And the other part is it gives application developers a lot of more extensibility to say, here's my own custom file format. I have my custom rights that I would like to enforce on my application. So it gives a little bit of growing room for application developers that want to implement their own custom detail. Now, basically within that identity certificate, there's kind of two main characteristics of it. So one is who's the user that the certificate is associated with. The second part is what's their email address. So a lot of the applications out there today that are integrating with RMS actually embed the email address of the user as a part of that. And the reason for that is as content flows inside, outside of your organization, SIDS won't carry over to that. So RMS supports both SIDS and emails, but once you're sharing documents outside of the organization, you're not going to be able to get a SID to evaluate from an external organization unless you have some two-way trust, which I don't think is going to happen, right? And then there's kind of two additional parts to RMS. So there's also server certificates. So what's known as an FLC, and I'll detail a little bit more what that is a little bit later in a couple of slides. And then there are also machine certificates. And basically on the machine certificate, what that is validating the identity of the machine that's connecting to the servers. And basically there's a key that's contained within there that essentially provides the private key that's used to decrypt the content that's given back from the server itself, so then the user can open it. All right, so let's kind of dive into little details of, well, what's a publishing license? Well, basically, for every RM protected document that's created, something that's known as a publishing license or a PL is created. Now, it's very similar kind of, if you're setting an ACL on a file share within Windows to say, hey, who has read permissions, who has print permissions, copy, etc. Now, the actual contents of those, you can actually, within the publishing license itself, it's going to contain groups or users, right? So I can name a person as an individual, I can put in a group within there, and what's going to happen is the RMS server is then going to contact the AD. It's going to actually do, for example, with groups, it's going to do a group expansion to say, hey, is the user a member of this given group? And if the answer is yes, we'll issue what's known as that end use license back, and if no, the user doesn't get access to it. The second part is we'll also look up user identities in the AD. So if I call out, name an individual explicitly, we'll then go to make sure that we have a matching object in the AD. And if they do, we'll then give them rights to the document. But the real big part about it, what's expressed in the PL, is the actual rights, right? So there are essentially 4 or 5 core rights within RMS. So there's kind of the view, edit, owner, which are a little bit different than this. But essentially from there what happens is application integrators can then add their own custom policies to their particular file format type and what's applicable to their logic and their application. So for example, in Outlook, one of the ones is, hey, do not forward. So that's a very email-centric type of right. So it allows people to express a lot of different rights within their applications. So one thing I wanted to show is, hey, where does all this stuff live on the user's machine? All right. So essentially, if you end up going, so if you ever kind of poked around your machine, what the RMS client does, it actually stores use licenses and kind of the RMS artifacts for the system within this folder called under your users, application data, local, Microsoft, and then DRM, right? So within here, I have this is my actual real account. So there's something which is called a GIC, and that's kind of our coding sample. But essentially, that's your rights account certificate that's stored that the RMS server provides back to you. The next one within there is your CLC. So as I mentioned before, the CLC is what comes off of the server and it allows you to publish content against the server itself. And then the last one is the machine certificate, which essentially at the end of the day is going to have the private key which enables people to decrypt content. So one of the things a lot of people are like, well, what do these files mean, right? So if I go ahead and, for example, and open this up, you're just going to see a bunch of just random nonsense, right? And it's going to say, I mean, it's kind of human readable, but essentially XRML is very similar. I mean, it's an expression-based language, right? So it's like XML. So kind of if you do the right parsing and put it together again, here's kind of what a publishing license looks at. So this is just a sample publishing license. But essentially what ends up happening is here's really the core format of how RMS works. So one is, for example, I use the rights template, and I'll describe why a little bit later. But essentially within here, what it's going to say is, hey, who's the owner of this particular content? And then this is just a sample one I protected back to someone else. But then who actually has rights to the particular content? So in this case, the owner and the recipient are the same, because I forgot to generate one with the full list. But essentially, it's all in XRML, right? So if you go down there a little bit below, it's going to, for example, this is for Microsoft, one of the Microsoft Office generated publishing licenses, but it's going to tell you which applications are in there and kind of the policies around that. Now, what it also ends up letting applications do is specify application-specific data. So if there's a certain behavior that the application would like to express, they can actually add it, it's extensible to where they can add their own behaviors within it. But essentially, this is, just taking that other notepad document and it's basically saying, well, here's the XRML for it. And what it actually contains, and I'll talk about the templates a little bit later, is, hey, where is this content protected to? What's the GUID on the server that we need to evaluate? And a couple of other things I'll drill into a little bit more details about in just a few minutes. All right. So the next part is what's the end-use license, right? So when you're consuming content, remember, you're actually getting an end-use license back. So the PL is what the publisher of the content does, and the use license is what the consumer of the content gets back. So basically, the use license, as I mentioned before, is derived from the publishing license and the document from the server. So essentially, what RMS is going to do is going to take that publishing license, decrypt it, and then do an authorization against the Active Directory to understand what rights a given user has to a document. So once we've done the end-use license, what it ends up getting back to the user is essentially the rights that they have to a given document. Now the next part about it is use license. So that one is they can't be transferred among users, right? So all use licenses are bound to that individual. So I can't just say, hey, give me this use license, someone's protected content, for example, to Joe, but then I can't just go to Joe's machine, take that end-use license, bring it into my certificate store, and then open the content, right? Everything's bound back to the user it was intended for. 2, end-use licenses only work on the original device they were requested, because every time that you open it, basically there's a machine key, and that machine key is what ends up binding and doing that decryption back to the end-use license. So for example, if you're going to multiple machines, and there are exceptions to the rule, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, basically what's going to happen is you'll have to re-request the rights from the server again. And like I mentioned, the actual request sizes are very small, and it also depends on how frequently a user is changing machines, or it depends on the scenario they're using, but most of the time they're pretty sticky once you have the rights to the document. Third is they can be cached or not. So depending on the policy that was set on the given document, that's what's going to determine whether we're caching an end-use license or not. So for example, a lot of our customers that I've seen say, hey, you know what? This is very sensitive data. I don't want to be able to have someone cache that information, locally. What I want them to do is to say, hey, every single time you're making a request to the server, I want to capture that, I want to log it, so I know exactly who has accessed the document when. And also, if the data is changing quite frequently, or if there are different groups that are associated with that document, you can always update those on the RMS server to say, well, originally we started out with this small group that has access, and we're going to make them request access every time. Second type of example is, well, now I want a broader set of people to do it, so I can update my template to say, hey, this new group, which contains more people, can have access to it, but they need to be able to come back to the server every time to request access to it, so I can keep a log of who's accessed that particular data. And a third is it can have a lifetime, right? So within the policy template, you can actually define the lifetime for how valid or how long the use license is valid for. So I was mentioning you can set it from anywhere from a week up to 7 years, or not even have a lifetime if you don't want to specify one with it. And so let me pull up an example of that. All right. Oops. So here's an end-use license that I've pulled out for one of my Outlook items itself, and basically what it's going through and saying, oh, thanks. There we go. So here's an end-use license, and so within here, basically it's saying who has access to the given content. So in my case, it's me, because I publish it to myself. But if you kind of notice a little bit above, so basically what it's saying is which user identity did I bind it to? And what we're talking about, the first layer, is the group identity. So remember that thing I called a rack? Well, within our internals of the system, it's actually called a group identity. And what it's saying is the user that I bound it to has a Windows SID of this, but then the email address for that particular user is this right here. It then details out the algorithm we use to encrypt the data to, and which keys we were using with that based on the server. And then essentially what it's going to end up doing is detail the rights that I have to this particular data itself. So in this case, it's basically an Office document or Outlook, because they kind of share a lot of components. It's going to tell me the ID type, but in this particular case, it's actually bound to my email address, because that's what Office does. But then it actually lists out all of the rights that I actually have to it. But since I published it, I automatically have the owner rights. But for example, if I, as the publisher, had specified that, hey, Tejas only has read rights or print rights, it'll actually have the tags that mark what particular rights a user has to that document. So it provides a good level of extensibility, once again, for application developers to say, hey, well, my custom application, I only want it to do this, right? You have to build it back to the business logic. But from the RMS perspective, it's translating into those basic rights and then leaving it up to the application to interpret the usage rights they want to be able to provide back to the users once the content has been decrypted. All right, moving along. So for templates, instead of, a lot of times within Word, for example, what you have to do is you have to go into kind of the permissions dialog box and say, hey, I want to give this user this particular right, this particular right, this particular right. And sometimes users aren't going to find the dialog box, or it makes it very difficult for them to say, well, what's the right policy for a given document? So instead of indicating a list of rights, you can indicate what are known as templates that are created on the RMS server itself. So basically, within the publishing license, when you apply a template to an RM protected document, or when you're creating an RM protected document and you apply a template to it, basically the publishing license is it's going to list what's known as a GUID, right? And the GUID is essentially saying, okay, we have the set of rights to interpret on the server side itself and not explicitly within the template. And that does a couple of things. So one is, because the server side, because the rights are actually defined on the server, for example, let's go back to my previous example. So at one point, you defined an AD group that belongs to a template that only provided folks, kind of the print and copyright. Well, let's just say at a later point, that wasn't the correct set of rights that you wanted to provide to your users. You're saying, okay, that might be a little too restrictive. So then what you can do on the RMS server is actually change the rights for that particular document. And then the next time, so instead of just, print and copy, basically you say, okay, I need for these users to be able to print the document. What you can actually do is remove the, no print right. And basically the next time the document comes back to the server again for a use license, what the RMS server will say is, oh yeah, you know what, that policy that was applicable for this particular GUID isn't still applicable, and now I'll just restrict it to the copy permission only. So it provides a great bit of flexibility, especially when you're first deploying RMS, to kind of get the balance right between what your users want and the restrictions that you want to enforce within there. The second part about it too is, let's go back to another example of, hey, I had a small group defining the template, but now people want to be able to kind of consume that document in a broader group. Well, I can just change the group on the template, so any subsequent requests that come back to the RMS server are reevaluated to use the new group instead of the original group that was defined. So it makes it a lot easier than having individual docs when someone actually creates a file with individual rights and someone doesn't have access to it. Well, then it's really the onus of the publisher of that document to adjust the rights to provide those additional rights to the users that need access to it. And that becomes a little bit more overhead for end users. So templates are a great way to kind of manage around that. The next part, kind of as I was talking about earlier, is that templates are centrally managed. So once you create a set of rights management templates on the server, basically that's the source of truth for all, essentially for all templates. So once you've created the templates, you've distributed the templates, either our client can pick them up or manually. Basically, those templates are consistent, so you don't have all these segmented or segregated policies throughout your organization. For example, if I said to a user, hey, this is confidential data, and we left it up to them to say, well, what rights do I need to assign to a document? It's going to get kind of confusing over a period of time, right? It's like, is it read, is it write, is it don't copy, is it don't print? Templates provide kind of a good container to say, well, here's all the information you need, it's confidential, and it's centrally managed throughout, but it's actually consistent is a more important part throughout your organization. All right, so kind of here's templates in action. So essentially, what we're going to go ahead and do is send a document over to a recipient, and then what's going to happen on the RMS server itself, there's actually a SQL server that's running in the background, and that SQL server is going to keep the latest templates that are available to RMS. And then basically the ARM-enabled application is going to request a use license with the latest rights. So this goes back to the example of, hey, I've modified the template. Now have the recipient request the use license, and then the server is going to do the evaluation and then return it back to the user again. So it's a very simple thing, and I'll show you an example of that in a few minutes. The next part, I really wanted to kind of drill into the overview of ADRMS components. But before I go there, once again, I just wanted to kind of call out that, hey, it's really simple. You have something that's encrypted to the server key. The server's going to decrypt it, and then it's protected back to the user's key. At the end of the day, that's what's happening underneath the covers for RMS. And if you can walk away, I just want to keep kind of bringing that up again, because if that's the one thing that you get out of this talk, it'll make understanding RMS much easier in the future. One thing, so there's really three components to ADRMS. So one is the ADRMS server. And what the ADRMS server really does is it's responsible for two things. So one is providing back the user certificate to the user based on their identity. So RMS is a very identity-centric application, right? So essentially, identity is the core of everything that we do. So essentially, if someone tries to access a document and their identity doesn't match, basically it's game over, right? We're not going to be able to evaluate the usage policies, and the access is going to be denied to a given user for a given piece of content. The second is, it's really all about the licensing of the ADRMS content. So basically it's doing all the authorization on a given publishing license to say, hey, what rights does a user have when requesting content or when requesting access from the server? The next piece is the ADRMS client. So the ADRMS client is running on every client machine, and it interacts with all the ADRMS enabled applications. Now the ADRMS client, we actually have right now 3 versions of that. So there's our V1 version, which, and I guess version 1 SP2, which actually works on XP. And then we actually ship, and for that particular client, you actually had to go download it from the download center, install it, etc. Starting with Vista, the actual client ships within Windows. So essentially, you don't have to sit there and deploy the client to make all of this stuff work again. It's just within the box. Windows 7 also has a client, so it kind of takes away one deployment step from administrators to have to worry about who has it, who doesn't have it, and kind of the pain of deploying it everywhere. The next part are ADRMS-enabled applications. So from the Microsoft side, basically what's going to happen is applications are actually going to have to integrate with our RMS client to deliver these capabilities. And so some versions of apps actually allow protecting the content by defining usage rights. Others just strictly rely on templates from the RMS server to say, here are the rights that you're getting. Now, the big thing is in order to do this, you have to use the ADRMS SDK and integrate your application with RMS to get it all to work. But those are kind of the big three kind of RMS components, and we'll start kind of digging into a little bit more of the terminology. So the first part from the server side is what's known as a certification server or a cluster. And kind of as I noted below, cluster doesn't mean like Windows Server clustering services. I think we're trying to rename it over a period of time. But essentially, it's going to be a web farm, right? Because all of RMS is actually just built on IIS, so it's using standard HTTP SOAP protocols. So for example, if you want to give users access to content from outside of the enterprise boundary, you're able to just use their standard firewall ports, for example 443, to allow traffic to come into the RMS server to actually get their use licenses, instead of using some of the other protocols such as RPC, where you have to open up additional ports. So this is all HTTP SOAP-based requests to the RMS server. Now, the first ADRMS server within a deployment is actually called the certification server. So anytime you first go in, deploy RMS, the first server that you're going to bring up is what's known as a certification server. And basically what it's going to do is it's going to provide the racks back to the users, right? So it's going to provide certification of the users. And the second is it's going to provide the licensing capabilities for users. Now, one other concept that we do have available is what's known as a licensing server. And the licensing server is essentially a subordinate server of the certification server. And what the licensing server allows you to do is, let's just say, for example, you're in a geographically distributed company and you have a lot of RMS traffic. So what the licensing server enables you to do is to stand up another server that's rooted to the main key, and it enables content to be licensed from that particular server instead of having to take another hop to the main server. Now, like I mentioned before, the traffic for RMS is very small. And for example, at Microsoft, we have several deployments, but our main deployment actually just consists of 5 servers, and those 5 servers serve our entire user population. Actually, not entire user population, about 96% of our user population throughout the world. So it's a very low, so there isn't a lot of traffic, and there are a couple of optimizations that Exchange has made to make that a lot better for the user experience that we'll talk about in a few. Next part is kind of the concept of a cluster. So the cluster is basically a web farm, and behind that web farm you have your SQL servers that persist all of the stateful data that RMS needs, such as your configuration, your templates, a bit of caching, and also logging information. We'll talk about that as well. So kind of looking at it from a basic ADRMS topology, so you're essentially going to have your web farm of servers kind of in your root cluster that's connected to a SQL database. And then you can also have a licensing only cluster as well. Now, the licensing only, like I mentioned, is basically, hey, huge geographically distributed population with a lot of traffic that needs to be licensed. That's the main purpose to do that. The second is if you need additional level of granularity with the policies that you're defining. For example, hey, I want my HR department to have these set of templates and fix, and it's only for the HR department. That's the other reason to do a licensing only server as well. So there's kind of 2 purposes. One is for geographic load distribution, and the second is to provide more segmented policies. Moving on. So kind of from the infrastructure component, here's what we're dependent on. So we have the ADRMS server, which ships in Windows Server 08, Windows Server R2, Windows Server 08 R2. Then basically the components that we're dependent upon are the Active Directory and SQL Server. And Active Directory, what we use is for a couple of things. And one is the group expansion, and 2 is to essentially provide client the capability to discover where the RMS server is. And then the last part is kind of the applications that are dependent upon RMS or have RMS capabilities built in. So one is SharePoint Services 2007 and 2010, and then Exchange Server 2007 SP1 and Exchange Server 2010 plus. Now the AD RMS server, like I mentioned, runs on Server 2008 and R2. And like I mentioned, it's just a web service. So you don't, if you want to enable external access to content, you don't have to punch additional holes through your firewall. It's already available if you allow inbound traffic from outside, right? So I don't have to create the RPC port, et cetera. So one of the dependencies that we have is we run in with an IIS, and we're dependent on ASP.NET from a component. So anytime in Server 08 or R2, once you click install, well, go ahead and install all the dependencies so you don't have to muck around with, hey, install this component, install that component. It'll all just be installed as a part of the server role itself. The next part is this is pretty stateless, right? So there aren't any transactions that are actually essentially queued within the actual server itself. So for example, a client makes a request. It's not going to sit there and say, hey, if the server goes down or something flaky happens, it's not going to hold on to the request. It'll ask the client to, basically the client has the logic to call back into it again. So it makes it a lot smoother depending on, if you have a really low bandwidth connection or a fragile connection in some parts of the world that still have that, makes it a much more robust experience. But the big thing is, hey, if something happens to a particular front end, hardware goes out, et cetera, essentially you're not losing any data. It's just a matter of getting a new server up and connected to the database, and your transactions can continue to happen. Now kind of the next part is, we have 3 databases associated with RMS. So one is a configuration database. So the configuration database basically hosts all the configuration data for RMS. And what it actually contains is all of the templates, for example, any of the policies that you've enabled. It actually persists all of the user keys that are given back to users upon the certification process. And it actually contains the server public key. So we do offer a lot of flexibility as to how to store the server the server key pair. This even more specific, the server private key. So we can support HSMs. We have a couple of inbuilt mechanisms. So there's flexibility on that, but it contains the core information for how RMS works. Now the one thing is, if there's one database to always keep track of and making sure that you're backing it up and you have redundancy, it's the configuration database. Without the configuration database, none of the front ends are going to work. And so it's really the most kind of important part as a part of your deployment, when you're thinking about your deployment, to make sure that you have a great plan to have, backup, restore, et cetera, of your SQL server, specifically the configuration database. Next database is a caching database. So as you know, we're going to the Active Directory a lot to actually do authorization for group expansion. So we actually have a local cache of the most frequent group expansion that we do. So instead of having to go all the way to AD, we create a local cache and then essentially do local lookups instead of having to contact the AD every time. And then the third is the logging database. And essentially what the logging database is more analogous to basically all the transactions that we've provided back to users. So when someone requests rack from the server, we'll log that data. If someone requests a use license, we'll log that data. So what that ends up allowing you to do is to say, hey, we want to see kind of, we're seeing funny activity happening on this given server. And what happens a lot of times is, hey, who accessed this file at what time is kind of one use case of it. The second part is, hey, a user's having trouble opening content. How do I troubleshoot that? So within our management console, we have a couple of troubleshooting capabilities which says, hey, for this given user, why aren't they able to open the content? And the way that we're able to determine that is the RMS server actually looks at the logging database to determine what rights they have to a given document or what their most recent activity was to aid in troubleshooting issues. Last point is most operations are performed asynchronously. So basically what we do is do the processing. So for instance, we use MSMQ underneath the covers. So for example, if the logging database is out, we can start queuing up requests in MSMQ. So at a later point, we can flush those all into SQL Server itself to write the logs in. And the last point is that the database isn't available, which, and it's really about the logging database. AD RMS continues to work almost normally. So, and I should clarify that. It's really all about the logging database. Configuration database, you're always going to need. So, That one goes at a little bit less sensitive, but it'll still continue to be able to provide use licenses back to users. Next part is Active Directory. So like I mentioned, I think we talked about it already, but basically AD is providing authentication to the users. The next part is all AD RMS accounts, and this is, must have an email account to interoperate with Office applications. The other part is we also rely on SIDS, but as I mentioned earlier, SIDS going across organizational boundaries just doesn't work. So we rely on email addresses a lot to be able to enter that data into the actual rights account certificate, the end use licenses, and the publishing licenses. The big part here is what AD also provides us is a service connection point for RMS clients. And we'll talk about a little bit about the service discovery process later. But essentially, if you're within an enterprise, you've deployed RMS, you have your clients ready to go, your applications ready to go, the first time you click the publish button, what the RMS client's going to do is actually look at the service connection point within the AD to say, hey, where's the location of the RMS server so that users can perform client service discovery. Last part is, once again, group membership. So Active Directory should be in native mode for group propagation. The other part, too, is that we rely on universal groups, and also basically we look at we do global catalog requests rather than just straight up DC requests. The next part is, and this is an important consideration, that there's you have to deploy one AD RMS root cluster per forest, and because AD RMS certification currently is limited to users in an AD forest. So when you deploy an RMS server, the default scope for RMS is within a forest. If you're deploying to multiple forests, you'll actually have to deploy at least one certification cluster per forest, but what you can actually specify is a central licensing cluster. And essentially, when you configure RMS, there are two parts to it. So one is, where do my users need to come to get their rights account certificates? And two is, when I create the publishing license, you can actually specify an alternate URL which points to a different RMS server, so you can actually consolidate all of the licensing operations within your enterprise. All right, so here's kind of the AD RMS client initialization in detail. So essentially, the user initiates the first IRM operation. So I click, publish within Office. It'll then find the certification URL, and then it's going to find that certification URL through Service Discovery or the SCP. You can actually use registry overrides, and we'll talk about that. Then the client's going to authenticate against the certification URL via the AD, right? So I have to get that user identity in. We're going to authenticate that identity against the AD. And then basically what's going to happen, and this is the bootstrapping process again, right? We're going to issue back the machine and user certificates back to the user. What we're then going to do is we're going to redirect the client, right? So this is where if a user has created a separate licensing URL, the client will then go to that licensing URL, and it's going to pick up the CLC, or what gives the user the capability to essentially create a publishing license. And once you get the CLC, everything's good. And then as a user, if you've never bootstrapped before and you received a piece of content and you haven't bootstrapped against a server, what's going to happen is the client's going to go through its initialization. So it's going to go ahead and get that rack, it's going to go ahead and get a CLC, and then it's also going to try to get a use license if someone's trying to consume content for the first time. All right, so kind of from how clients find RMS, so I'll kind of go through this pretty quickly. So the first part is we're going to look at the service connection point in the AD for that forest, and basically there's an object category in there for AD RMS, so you just have to edit that value with the correct permissions. Now the other part is we also support this other type of service discovery, which is consumption first. So essentially, hey, I might be outside of the organization or not connected to the AD, but if I give someone a document, essentially in the publishing license, it's going to contain the URL of the RMS server itself. And what's going to happen is the client's just going to use that URL and then contact the RMS server. If the user has the right credentials, it's going to allow them to go through and get an end-use license. Now, you can also kind of configure, in a pre-deployment stage, you can actually set registry key overrides to point to the RMS server, but what we found in larger deployments is that becomes really fragile over a period of time. So the ideal is to set an SCP, but if you're kind of doing it in a pilot or pre-production, registry keys do the trick very well. Basically, once the client finds the initial endpoint, from there, we actually have other web services on our RMS server that will then get the client pointed to the right location as well. All right, so this is kind of the one main slide. So I don't want to go into too much details, but I mean, this all really gets back to the original concept of, hey, there's a key on the server that's protected content. Once it decrypts content, it's actually then protected back to the user key. So there's actually two components to this. So one is the server license or certificate. So this is what's generated on the server side, right? So the SLC is a server identity. And then below there, in the lower half of the diagram, is the SPC, or essentially the machine identity. And so this is kind of how everything chains together. So I know it's early in the morning, and I don't feel like looking at this. I don't know if everyone else does, but let's keep it very simple. And this slide's actually published up, so if you want to review it in more detail later, you can. But essentially, at the end of the day, the SLC key does two things. So one is going to issue the rack for the users, and it's also going to issue the CLC, which enables the user to protect content to it. And then kind of on the bottom half, if you take a look at the rack on the left-hand side, essentially you have this thing that's called the SPC, which is installed on each machine, right? It's a server, security processor certificate. And essentially that chains all the way down to a private key that's installed on your machine. And what that enables you to do is basically, or what enables the system to do is when content is then protected back to the user rack, that private key for the rack is then chained all the way down to the security processor certificate, which is ultimately responsible for decrypting content. And then once we take a look at the publishing license, so this is essentially the PL. Basically what's happening here is the content key is actually the public key of the server license or certificate. And then the issuer is actually the CLC, which is then signed by the SLC. And then the end use license is essentially the issuer for that is the SLC again, and then you end up having the content key, which gets protected back to the public key of the user, which then it allows it, once you kind of go through the rest of the chain right below there, the private key is then encrypted with the public key of the SPC, and the private key of that is on your machine, which at the end of the day, what it's allowing is a decryption of content back to the user again. So trying to keep it simple, but that slide will be posted up. One of the last concepts I want to talk about is kind of the super user. So a lot of times, companies might be going through e-discovery requirements, or they have to do discovery for legal purposes, and there are also capabilities that other applications provide that require super user privileges. Super user privilege can be defined on the AD-RMS server, and it's essentially an AD group that's already defined in the AD. You then go to the AD-RMS server, and you say, hey, I want to enable super user privileges. Now, when you give this right, or this privilege, essentially what you're saying is whoever has that right can open any content that's been protected to the RMS server. By default, we disable it because it should be an explicit choice that someone has to make on who to grant the specific privileges to. But it's actually used by a couple of applications and tools that we have. So one is a bulk protection tool. And essentially what the bulk protection tool allows you to do is two things. One is allows, as it says, to protect content. So if you have a file share, you've just deployed RMS, you can use a tool to say, hey, go ahead and protect all these go ahead and protect content on this given file share or file shares to a specific policy. Two, it actually allows for bulk decryption. So for example, if you're doing legal discovery, you have a set of files that are encrypted, you don't want to have to go spend the time to say, manually say, because with super user privilege, say, hey, remove permissions, remove permissions, remove permissions. The tool is scriptable. You can say, hey, anything within this file share, go ahead and decrypt it, so you don't have to have any sort of manual intervention to decrypt content. The next is for Exchange transport scanning. So within Exchange 2010, essentially any content that goes through that's protected within the organization, we want to be able to make sure that that content can be decrypted, right? So we want to make sure there isn't any malware. We want to be able to add disclaimers to the mail. We want to be able to do some additional actions. So essentially, super user privileges for Exchange are required to do the decryption action. And finally, the last is Exchange journaling. So one of the key feature requests we've had recently is, hey, I've deployed this thing called RMS, but you know what? I have some highly regulated people that are kind of sitting at the exec level or higher, and I actually need to keep a copy of the message in the clear, so in case a regulator wants to come in, I don't have to go run the bulk decryption tool. I actually have a copy of the message in the clear. So what Exchange journaling does is it keeps a copy of the protected message, and then it also creates a copy of the message in the clear that can be then saved to an archive, so you don't have to go through and manually decrypt everything or periodically have a job that's running through and doing it and dumping it out into a PST, et cetera. It just does it all on the server side. All right. So some kind of considerations before I open up the floor. So one thing is RMS must be deployed in each AD forest. So and what that means is essentially for user certification, I have to be able to certify users locally. We do have this, what's known as a concept of a trusted user domain. So if you do enable your AD RMS to have kind of essentially, a consolidated licensing location, what's needed to be configured on the RMS server is what's known as a TUD, or a trusted user domain. And the trusted user domain is actually independent of any Active Directory trust. It's actually an RMS concept. And all that's saying basically is, hey, for this given forest A, actually what it's saying is, let's just say I have 3 forests, forest A, forest B, and forest C. And forest C is where I actually do, all of my licensing. When the user makes a request to the RMS server in forest C, what it's going to say is, hey, I actually trust the rack from forest A to be able to conduct a transaction against my server in forest C. So it's a pretty simple concept, but you'll have to configure that by default, and it usually takes less than 5 minutes to do that. 2, the licensing service, so let's take that example again, right? So let's just say now I have forest D that's actually doing licensing too. So 95% of my licensing traffic goes to forest C, 5% of that licensing traffic goes to forest D. So essentially, when you protect content to a server and you're trying to decrypt it, only that one server can decrypt it. Now, if there is the need to actually say, well, I also want forest D to be able to decrypt the content that was protected to forest C, you have to create what's known as a trusted publishing domain and a TPD. And essentially what the trusted publishing domain is going to contain is a server licensor certificate, public key, and private key for forest C that you actually have to import into forest D. And usually the main reason we see TPDs out there is basically, let's just say you've had a merger or acquisition, but you want to be able to maintain access to the content that was protected against the previous key. So typically what's going to happen is someone will bring up the new RMS server with the new company name, and what they'll then do is take that TPD and then import it into that new cluster so you can maintain access to your older content. The next part is kind of, we've talked about it before, AD-RMS can't serve users in forest without AD-RMS, but basically one of the big asks from customers is, hey, it works great within the enterprise boundary. How do I enable, my partners or external users to have access to it? So there's another presentation, I think, already on the web that kind of talks about the collab capabilities, but it's basically, we have this one service which is called ILS, but it allows users to get a rack from this service, and on this RMS server itself, what you can do is say, hey, I'm going to trust Windows Live IDs for content, right? So if I distribute a doc outside, the experience is the user will get it. They'll then, within Office, get the experience to say, hey, you can't authenticate against the RMS server. Would you like to use this other service? Once you go through the login process, what will then happen is you'll get the rack from that server, and essentially you'll make a request back to the RMS server where the content was published. You'll then be able to get a use license for that content itself. The next is ADFS. So ADFS is a feature that was, ADFS integration, was a feature that was first deployed within Windows Server 2008. And what it enables you to do is to use ADFS integration to then federate with partner companies to say, hey, I'm Fabricam, this is my partner Contoso, I already have a federation trust that exists between the two companies, so if a user from Fabricam sends something to Contoso, that Contoso user will come to the RMS server, the federation dance will happen, they'll get authenticated against their server, and then essentially once that transaction happens, they'll then get bootstrapped against the sender or the publisher's RMS server and then gain access to content. So one of the capabilities, and I'll be talking about it a little bit later, or in my next session, is kind of forward-looking, like how do we enhance our collaboration capabilities, how do we kind of further, broaden the ecosystem, because we don't want to just we want to be able to allow anyone to get RM-protected content, and so long as they have the correct privileges. So quick note on Exchange, I won't get time to kind of go through all the details, but Exchange, starting with Exchange 2007, there's a feature called pre-licensing. So one of the top pieces of feedback that we had received with RMS is within email, once an email is delivered, then originally a user would actually have to click on the mail, wait a couple of seconds, get the use license and bring it back. And people were kind of getting a little bit frustrated, right? Because you've gotten the email, now I'm having to talk to this other thing to now get a use license. So a feature that was introduced starting with Exchange 2007 was the capability to do pre-licensing. And essentially what pre-licensing does, Exchange will get a use license on behalf of the user, and it'll actually bind it back to the user's public key in the background. So it'll call into the RMS server, get the use license. The RMS server will then get the public key for the user and protect it back. So basically, when the user receives a message, they already have access to the content without having to wait a few more seconds to get the use license from the server. So that's one of the kind of user optimizations, and we're seeing many more applications starting to pick up on that kind of flow rather than having the user have to go back and request it every time. But basically, the Exchange Hub transports know about the protected messages and they request the license, etc. So that's one of the big things. Now, Exchange 2010 actually added in a lot of IRM integrated features. The big one was protected content in OA. So we had seen within companies, hey, I'm not only using Windows, I might be using a Linux desktop, I might have a Mac, I might have a lot of other things, but essentially I might be working from a kiosk. So one of the things that OA does is basically enables the capability to now protect and view IRM protected messages in OA. So I don't know if anyone was familiar with the old way, but essentially there was this client add-on that you had to get, the sign-on experience was a little bit goofy, and then finally after clicking the right buttons you'd be able to view the content rendered read-only in a web page. But now within OA you're able to actually view IRM protected content on Firefox, Safari, IE browsers without having to add or install any additional software onto a user's machine. So it makes it a lot flexible, especially if you're not carrying a laptop on vacation, someone sends you an IRM protected message, you can just take a look at it within Outlook Web Access. Now for that, everything's rendered server-side on behalf of the user and then is displayed in the client, on the client with their correct usage restrictions applied. However, there are concerns to say, well, this web browser isn't, is allowing users to circumvent usage restrictions. Well, you can actually, there's a policy within Exchange to disable access via OA to ensure that, hey, only Outlook can open, you can specify that. Next part is the forefront protection for Exchange. So it enables the capability to scan messages. So one of the key things is, hey, we want to make sure that we're not propagating any malware or any viruses via RMS. So forefront protection for Exchange can actually, Exchange will actually get a use license, decrypt the content, then it enables Forefront to be able to analyze the content, and then as soon as it's analyzed it, it'll re-protect the content and deliver it back to users. Last is search capabilities. So basically if you're using, and doing any sort of e-discovery on the Exchange server as a server administrator, basically Exchange can go ahead and create an index of all messages, right? So prior to this, basically if there are any RM protected messages, it would throw off the indexing process. So now if you want to search within Exchange server to say, hey, find message with, subject foo within it, and it's RM protected, it'll actually be able to go through that content itself. All right, integration with SharePoint. So, and I'll go through this because I'm about out of time, but SharePoint can store, it gives what's known as IRM protected document libraries. So within SharePoint itself, when you create an IRM protected document library, what it's doing is actually creating essentially a container. Now, as the administrator, you can specify the rights to a given document library, right? You can say read or who has access to a particular document library. Now, the key is when a user actually checks out the file from SharePoint, that's when the protection is applied to the file itself, bound to the specific user. Then once the file is put back into SharePoint, the protection is removed and it's stored within there. And the big thing for that is what that enables SharePoint to do is still maintain all of their indexing capabilities and search capabilities within there, but anytime the document leaves SharePoint, it's always protected. All right, so kind of give you a brief summary. So basically, ADRMS is a kind of basically PKI plus document encryption and policy, right? So when I say PKI, we're using a public-private key infrastructure to essentially protect content and make sure it's always protected at rest and in motion. Second is basically ADRMS is just an ASP.NET application that's running as a web service to issue certificates and license to users, right? So we're going to validate and verify anyone's identity. Once we verify that identity, that we allow them to publish. Once someone is published and the consumer gets it, then the consumer is going to call back into the server again, get the correct use license, decrypt it, or encrypt it back to that user so they can access the content. That's what's in a nutshell. Basically, the one core thing is when someone's creating a document, it's called a PL. When someone's consuming a document and the RMS server is returning something, it's a use license. And the RMS server is responsible for the authorization, essentially. So it's going to evaluate the usage rights and hand that back to the user again. And basically, the applications, it's up to them to enforce the usage rights that they've defined for their application. And the last, it's just, kind of says, it's just logic. There's a lot of inner workings, but at the end of the day, it's, hey, I'm decrypting something on the server, then I'm protecting it back to the user public. Or I've encrypted something, I'll decrypt that bit on the server, and then I'll protect it back to the user to make sure that content's always protected. All right, so I think that was that. But if we have a few minutes for Q&A, I know it's still in the morning, but if you guys want to go to the microphone and ask questions, I'd be glad to take some questions. Sure. All right. Oh, can we turn on that mic? Yes.
So what's the difference between SMIME and ADRMS? So if you only have SMIME deployed internally, I mean, I'm getting a little bit here. I mean, do we need SMIME in this case?
No. So you can actually replace SMIME with RMS. And what RMS does is, so for example, in the SMIME case, it's kind of similar to an ACL. So once the user actually has permissions to that document, even though it was encrypted, it's going to be in the clear. And if that user decides to say, hey, I want to now give it to someone else and remove essentially say, hey, copy the file out, the protection is removed, they'll be able to handle that. The bigger thing is the usage rights aren't enabled in SMIME. So if someone just wants to copy all that information out and then put it into another document and then give it to someone else, the usage rights are not maintained at that point.
So if you're deciding to go with the RMS and SMIME, drop SMIME, why you need SMIME in your organization?
Well, some organizations still have the requirement to do SMIME, so we're starting to see a steady pickup in RMS deployment. But some companies still like SMIME, and our team actually works on both. But we think RMS, kind of going in the future, kind of serves a broader set of needs for users. And one of the other key attributes of RMS is that the deployment model is a little bit simpler. So because we're generating all the keys, we own all the client server interactions end to end without having to rely on a lot of plugins, browsers, kind of interesting integration that we've seen in a lot of cases in SMIME.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have a few more.
Okay. Next.
Macintosh, etc.
Okay, so we've introduced support within Mac Office 2011 for IRM. So Excel, Word, PowerPoint, the new Outlook client within Mac Office 2011 support IRM. For other device types, there are two things. So one is we have a lot of third-party vendors that offer capabilities for BlackBerry and Apple and Google as well, or sorry, Android as well. One of the things that we've actually done in Exchange 2010 SP1 is the Exchange team has enabled IRM integration using Exchange ActiveSync. And so if any of the devices, such as the iPhone, basically if Apple or Android want to enable IRM capabilities on their phones, the protocol enables that now. So they don't have to install a client on their, OS images. They can actually write to the EAS protocol to have IRM capabilities. Yes.
How does it work when you're going to, someone external to your organization? So you're sending out to somebody at Microsoft. How does that piece tie in?
Okay, so the question was, how do I enable external collaboration, essentially? So what ends up happening is because the publishing license contains, so there's a couple of prereqs, right? One is, how do you want to be able to authenticate the user that's coming to your RMS server? So there are several different types of ways of doing that. What we've seen recently is more folks are moving to ADFS integration. And basically what that enables you to do is if you've created a federation agreement or partnership with another organization, what the RMS server will do is respect that, basically say, hey, force the authentication to happen back in their company, and then do the dance with our federation server. At the end of that, we'll get a token back that's then appended to our web service request. And as long as the token is valid, we'll then do the correct usage evaluation. And if the user has rights, they'll be able to access the content.
Email address?
Yes. So typically, within the publishing license, they're going to be identified by their email address. And what we'll do is once we get that publishing license, what we'll have to make sure of is that email address matches what the user identity is. Yep. All right, well, thanks so much for, oh, one more question in the back. Yes, so the question was, when I meant that Exchange can do indexing on items, can it also do discovery on those items? And the answer is yes. Yes.
RMS 2000.
Yes. Right, so the question is, can I upgrade from Windows Server 2003 RMS to Windows Server 2008 RMS? And the answer is yes. So we support several upgrade methods. One is you can actually do an in-place upgrade, but depending on your hardware, we've found a lot of people that don't do that. The second is we support this other functionality, which is essentially called what's known as a join upgrade. And what happens is you bring up your new RMS server, and there's this option called join, and what you do is you connect it to your SQL server that's running, that's backing up the Windows Server 2003. And what it'll do is it'll go ahead and do all the schema upgrades on that SQL server to support Server 2008 or Windows Server 2008. So you don't actually have to do the TPD move. Basically, you're essentially joining that cluster. The one thing that you will have to do, though, is make sure that the public-private key that you have stored is available to that new server. But you don't have to create a TPD to do that. Sure. I think I'm out of time, but well, I just want to thank everyone for coming. I know it was really early today, and by the way, I'm doing another session on RMS, kind of on our futures and directions right after this downstairs. Thank you.